here. Sit back and enjoy the show. Sunland Stitchers, and we have our knitting and crochet group joining together to put this show on. The quilts that you're going to be seeing are quilts that are from Sunland Stitchers, as well as from their families, as well as people in the village. So if you get chilly while we're having our show, there's a quilt behind some of the chairs, and you're welcome to wrap yourself up in one of them. And if you notice too, there's a price tag on them. If you are so inclined, if you love it, we will be happy to sell it for you, to you. So I think I sort of ad-libbed that. We'll begin. The title of our show is Once Upon a Time There Was a Quilter. And we have Diane and Lenore, who are our bed turners. There is our bed. So we'd like you to imagine that there is a nice bed made just for you. Once upon a time there was a quilter. Well, actually, there were many. Let's take a closer look at these vintage and unique quilts that are owned by members of our quilting group, Sunland Stitchers, or even residents in our village. And if you're here, raise your hand when I come to your quilt. First, we start with number 1, Doris Binder. Is Doris here? Doris Binder, a member of the knitting and crocheting group, discovered the joy of working with her daughter Carol on this Christmas quilt. Doris embroidered all the blocks in 2008, finishing them in only 5 weeks. Carol, who was 51 years old at the time, sewed the top together by machine. She then used an older quilting machine, not one of those fancy computerized ones, and created the quilting design by guiding the machine with her hands. We would now call that free motion quilting. This quilt travels between the homes of Doris and Carol, as they both own it and take turns hanging it on their own wall at Christmas time. They must love each other to share it. Doris lives here in SVE and Carol in Fort Collins, Colorado. They plan to keep this quilt in their family. Thank you. Number 2, Joan Falcon. Oh, and I need to just do a little step back. If I mess up anybody's name, please let me know, correct me. Joan Falcon inherited this crazy quilt from her grandmother. It was made by Melissa Jane Harvey Conley, her great-grandmother in 1935, at the age of 75. Melissa lovingly hand-stitched the pieces using a feather stitch and then tied the quilt sandwich together with yarn. Now there's a lot more to the story, so hang on, ladies. Look closely at the wool, cotton, and flannel fabrics, as some look like they came from prison uniforms, especially on the back, as you had just seen. Right, quilts from yesteryear were often made from outgrown or worn-out clothing. Joan states, "I feel this is a true Depression-era quilt made from scraps of many garments." The backing is pulled up and over the top edge and secured with hand stitching. This quilt is very heavy, weighing about 10 pounds. While some may say the quilt has lumpy batting, I prefer to think of it as having received much love and use in washing. It presently resides in Joan's cedar chest, neatly rolled on the bias in a pillowcase. Joan plans to will this quilt to her niece. The next quilt is our number 3. It comes with a registration number. It's registered 5821 by the Colorado Quilting Council and is owned by Joan Falcon. This variation of an 8-point star was made sometime between 1920 and 1930 in Washita, Iowa, by sisters, here we go with names, Ivanora Hoyt, Anna Conley, who were Joan's great aunts. The pieces are hand sewn and the sandwich is hand quilted with teeny tiny stitches, about 8 to 10 stitches per inch. Think about that. 8 to 10 stitches per inch. Ooh. Which were very likely stitched by several quilters, quite possibly at a quilting bee. The muslin and cotton fabrics show evidence of wear such as fold lines. The quilt is rolled on the bias and stored in a pillowcase in Joan's cedar chest made by her husband. Joan knew her great aunts very well and was fascinated by their black and white TV with the 11-inch diameter round screen. At their death, the quilt was taken to the home of Joan's grandmother, another sister, and then inherited by Joan, who plans to will the quilt to family. Very nice. Number 4, Pam Snow. And Pam's here in the back. Pam Snow owns the next quilt. These scrappy or strip piece blocks were hand pieced and hand quilted by Pam's mother, Marion Skaggs. Is that correct? Skaggs, who was in her early 20s, and Pam's grandma, Agatha Stearman, who was in her 40s in Greene County, Kentucky, during World War II. Since cotton was unavailable during the war, Pam's grandmother grew the cotton in her garden, which was used for the batting in this quilt. The fabrics are synthetics from garments. The top is pieced by hand, and the quilt is hand quilted. In 1942, Pam's mother married at the age of 18, and pieces of the dress were worn that day are in the quilt. Pam says she ran away and married my dad before a justice of the peace. He left a month later for the war. The back is made from feed sacks. Some of the pieces had holes, which were patched, and then the fabric was dyed before the quilt was constructed. Pam's mother didn't like this quilt, probably because of the fabric. The quilt was not used much, especially once the war was over and cotton became available. It survived the years safely tucked away until Pam found it in the bottom of a cedar wardrobe in Kentucky in 1976. She called her mom and asking for information about the quilt, to which her mom responded, "That old thing, just throw it away." Obviously, Pam did not. She is glad she found it and saved it along with its history. It currently resides in the same cedar wardrobe where Pam found it, but now in her house. The quilt will eventually be passed on to family members. Number 5. This single iris chain quilt was made in the early 1870s by Martha Jane Johnston Lyons. She is the great-grandmother of one of our members, Beverly Haslinger's husband, Jack. It was appraised in 2001 for $750. Jessie Lyons, also known as Jerry, was Martha's granddaughter, chronicled the journey this quilt has made in a book titled The Quilt, A Bedtime Story. In it, Jessie describes the 2,700-mile journey from Ohio to Iowa by covered wagon or stagecoach, and ladder was packed in an old-fashioned trunk and checked at the train depot in Osceola to its new home in California. It traveled in the baggage car of the Burlington train through the cornfields of Iowa and the wheat fields of Nebraska to Denver, Colorado, then by Santa Fe train over the mountains across the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona to California with its orange and palm trees. In the spring of 1948, the quilt made by Martha was put in a big wooden packing box and loaded in a lion van and storage truck. It traveled 50 miles through San Bernardino Valley, up over the mountains of Santa Susana Pass into the country community of Simi Valley. After 20 years, the quilt was made ready to go to a new home. Poor thing. It had been carefully washed and a few places mended and the edges whipped with white thread. Then on December 10th, 1971, it was folded into a gift box tied with a big yellow ribbon and taken to Linda Hasselner's great-great-grandchild of Martha. This time the quilt went by airplane. So it traveled from horse-drawn wagon, train to plane in its lifespan of 100 years. Linda is Beverly and Jack's daughter, and the great-great-grandchild of Martha who made this quilt. Beverly is storing it for Linda. In the book that Jessie wrote, she describes how this quilt was constructed. Every stitch in the quilt was made by hand with a needle and thread, and the thousands of tiny quilting stitches must have taken hundreds of hours. Now this book contains a message to Linda. You may be sure there was enough love put in those tiny stitches that some of it has come down through these 100 years to bless you. Guard the quilt, keep it with great care, and perhaps after many, many more years, it will surely bless your children or possibly grandchildren as they read and enjoy this bedtime story. So there's a book, part of the section that I read to you.
Can you see all the hands?
Isn't that amazing?
Amazing.
This 4-patch quilt, which is number 6, I hope we're on. This 4-patch quilt is owned by Kathy, now I know I'm going to mess this name up, one of our members, Kathy Roslowitz. Really? Oh my gosh. Yes. It was made by, oh dear, here's some more names. Marie Shevovitzy Toranjo in Watertown, New York, who is the aunt of Kathy's mom. This aunt helped raise Kathy's mom and siblings after their mother died. This quilt was made sometime before Marie's death in 1945. The top is pieced by hand and is hand quilted. Kathy acquired this quilt after her mom died. This quilt was always on her bed at the summer cottage when she was young. Kathy still uses this quilt when it's cold outside. This is number 7 coming up. This year, members of our quilting group, Sunland Stitchers, worked together to sew 3 quilts for a quilt auction held at our Hoedown fundraiser for our Fiber Arts Center in January. This quilt was one of those we made. You'll see another one with cowgirl boots displayed in the Oakwood room if you've been over there. For this quilt, which we refer to as the brick quilt, members of our group were invited to make bricks using 2 tone-on-tone fabrics, one lighter and one darker. This quilt includes 100 bricks made by 25 members, 4 bricks, and a dark blue setting square complete one block. This block looks more difficult than it is at its construction. The blocks were arranged and sewn together by Karen Turner and Cami Gamble, Pam Matlock, and Chris Tank. It was machine quilted by Flo Young and Sheila Miller. Chris Tank sewed on the binding, and 141 hours were spent making this quilt. Karen, Cami, and Pam used some of the bricks to create the interesting backing which the ladies are showing you. Here's a little secret about the back. I thought this was funny, Mark. This really is the second setting for the back. Upon an observation from Karen's husband, Mark, that the first one was bleh, it was taken apart and redesigned in order to create this more interesting pattern. This quilt sold for auction for $500. Anita Slater was the lucky winner of the raffle of this quilt at the auction. It is being used on Anita's bed. Thanks, Anita, for loaning us this quilt to use today. You'll have it back to keep you warm tonight.
That back looks way better than the first.
It's a man's eye.
This is a treat. Number 8, the Farewell Memory Quilt was made by twin sisters, Lenore Hirsch and Laura. Thank you, Laura. Or Lenore, thank you. Eichenberg. For their parents, Jean and Albert Thompson. And Lenore is one of our ladies holding up the quilts. The sisters were 35 at the time, and this was the first quilt they had made. The fabric crayon squares were done by friends and relatives. The sisters took a ready-made comforter and ironed-on sashing or hem tape and the crayon squares. They had only done a small amount of sewing and knew nothing about making quilts. They prepared 85 packets of block supplies and mailed them to friends and family. 60 finished blocks were returned. It took Laura and Lenore 4 months to complete this quilt from start to finish. The quilt has held up amazingly well, with only a few pieces coming loose. It's been on Dad's bed since 1985. I hope he didn't miss it too much last night. Isn't that amazing?
He has his,
That's great. Thank you.
he is 97.
97. I bet he loved it and loves it. The next quilt you'll see is called the Princess Feather Quilt. The top was made by Mary Lynn Warren's grandmother. The top hat was hand appliqued and the quilt was later machine quilted. Mary Lynn tells us when our quilting group had an appraiser come as a guest, she appraised our quilts, and we were told that when an old hand-pieced quilt was later machine quilted, they lose their value. During Mary Lynn's research to find out the name of this quilt, she received a call from a lady who had one just like it. I'm sorry I haven't turned to you, I apologize. A detailed label is located on the back, which includes this information. This quilt top was hand appliqued by Sarah Del Paint in the late 1800s. Della was born on December 1st, 1876 in Muscatine, Kansas. It was ultimately brought out of storage in 1994, where it had resided since her death on March 26, 1961 in Dayton, Washington, and machine quilted by John Bull in Mesa, Arizona. It was completed in the spring of 2001 by her granddaughter, Marilyn Warren said. Or Marilyn Warren is the granddaughter. This quilt, along with other hand-pieced, oh, you're done. Shoot. This quilt, the one that you just saw, this quilt, along with other hand-pieced tops made by her grandmother, was discovered in a trunk in the attic of Mary Lynn's mom. Mary Lynn inherited them and promised to finish them all, and she did. She then distributed them to her 2 daughters and 3 nieces. The quilt is presently owned by Mary Lynn's oldest daughter, but Mary Lynn is storing it for her. When you visit Mary Lynn, you'll see this quilt displayed in her entry. Thanks, ladies. Now we're on to number 10. Christine Tank found this square in a square quilt top in an antique mall in Boulder, Colorado. Want me to move back? Can you see it okay? The cotton fabrics are most likely original 1930 fabrics. There are 181 machine sewn blocks with each containing 13 pieces. There are a total of 2,353 pieces plus 181 lavender squares in this quilt. After purchasing the quilt, Chris cleaned it and stay stitched around the outside to secure the frame seams. She thinks it was made before modern quilting tools were available because the blocks were not squared. After being cleaned and repaired, the quilt spoke to Chris that it wanted to be tied to be finished. Actually, she realized it needed to be tied rather than machine quilted because it didn't lay very flat. Chris displays this quilt on a quilt rack made by her husband in their living room. Some quilts speak to being tied. That was a good one. This next quilt, I think we're on number 11, Diane. Yeah? The log cabin quilt measuring 67 inches by 80 inches also belongs to Cleo Perry. This quilt is a mystery. It was found in an old trunk in the attic of a farmhouse in Illinois where she grew up. There were no quilters in her family, and no one knew who made it or how it came to dwell in the attic. Cleo's sister-in-law, who lived in the house, gave it to Cleo. The top is hand-sewn and the quilt is hand-quilted. It is highly likely that most of all of the quilt pieces were cut from clothing. Cleo had it restored in 1982. The restoration was done by sewing the newer fabric over an original brown print that had become ripped and torn. The quilt presently sits on a closet shelf. During its reconstruction, Cleo also had a rod pocket added to the back. And the gals can show you that rod pocket. And it had hung in a previous home, and Cleo would like to hang it in her entry in her present home. This next one quilt belongs to Cleo Perry as well. This red and white quilt I just need to read what's here. This red and white quilt belongs to Cleo Perry, who keeps it in a trunk most of the time, but brings it out at Christmas to drape over her couch. This quilt measures 66 inches by 84. The top was pieced by hand and is hand quilted. There is some fading of red and yellowing of the white, but that happens with age. The binding is showing a lot of wear. The back is white muslin. The batting seems almost non-existent, maybe due to the deterioration. It was given to Cleo in 1970 from a friend who had received it from a relative. Cleo was also given several other quilts because her friend didn't have room for them and had no particular interest in them. Cleo, if you're here, let me talk to your friend, right? Love having those. The next three quilts are owned by our Diane Helen. This log cabin quilt was pieced by Diane's grandma, Dina, using whatever pieces of fabric she found. Grandma Dina made many quilt tops from 1920 to 1950. Many of her quilts remain as tops. This quilt was most likely pieced on a treadle sewing machine. Treadmill. I don't want to go back there until Monday. Okay. A treadle sewing machine with Diane's mom finishing it by hand. This quilt was displayed on the pool room wall in Diane's parents' home in 1990. In the 1990s, one day it was taken down, put away, and no one wanted to use it anymore. Someone may have discovered that one of the fabrics contained a swastika symbol. However, this symbol is also a Christian cross symbol, which is sometimes called the hook cross. This symbol in the Western world was a symbol of prosperity and good luck until the 1930s, when it became associated with the Nazi regime and referred to as a swastika. Diane says, "We are a Lutheran family, and the history behind the Nazi era with a Christian cross and swastika was not talked about." Note the fabric strips on the back of the quilt. They were added by Diane's mother in order to hang the quilt for display. Her mother, being an excellent sewer, made most of their clothes and would never have thought of using fabric for a hanging sleeve or for backing, deeming it absolutely wasteful. Sheets were often used to back a quilt, as is evident in this quilt. The quilt is in Diane's family. She is hoping one of her granddaughters may want it someday. Again, this is Grandma Dina hand stitching. Grandma Dina hand stitched this grandmother's flower garden. Isn't that pretty? Diane says that her grandmother made many quilt tops during the 1930s, probably as a creative outlet during the Depression years. Diane's mother found this quilt top along with other unfinished tops. One thought was that her grandma had access to feed sacks but couldn't afford the batting to complete them. After finding this quilt, Diane's mother took it apart to add the green fabric. She thinks that her mom wanted to make 2 quilts out of this top. Her niece has a smaller quilt from the blocks that Grandma made. Diane says, knowing that Grandma had hand quilted this and then Mother completed this quilt in the same way stitching is very precious to her. This quilt is on Diane and Charlie's bed at their North Dakota farm, as she believes it in using treasures from the past. She plans to give it to one of her daughters when she's done with it. Now this is Diane's last quilt to show. This orange and yellow 4-patch triangle quilt was also made by Diane's grandmother Dina. I'm thinking that Diane may have inherited her desire to use shades of orange and other vibrant colors from her grandmother. This quilt was a utility quilt, meaning it was made and completed for daily use. The fabrics were most likely cut from old clothes. Some of them have stayed in nice shape, but others are completely frayed. It was hand quilted, quite possibly by a group of neighbor ladies sitting around the quilt, which was pulled tightly around a frame. Diane remembers sitting under the frame. I love this part of your story. Frame and quilting bees held at her grandma's house. She remembers all the legs and funny shoes and black sturdy shoes that were laced up with tight bows of shoestrings and, of course, the 2-inch square heels. Diane and her grandma, Dina, had a special relationship as they only lived a mile apart. Diane's mother often told stories of chasing Diane at the age of 2 as she ran down the road going to see Grandma. When Diane was older, she would be seen and heard singing her heart out to the imaginary audiences, prancing and dancing. Could you do some of that? Prancing and dancing her way to her grandma's. This quilt is a well-loved memory quilt for Diane. She may repair it she may repair it as much as she can and use it for a cuddle quilt in her recliner someday in her old age. I love it.
Not yet.
Not yet, no. Now there are 3 quilts that you're going to see that are from I always say her name wrong. Adrienne Lander. She's a member of our quilt group. And they show the importance of labeling our quilts. Adrienne's machine piecing and machine quilted playful kittens is what you're looking at now. This quilt was inspired by one previously made by her cousin, Violet Urbanski, for her uncle Nick Hoffman. He was a furrier and a bachelor and a lover of cats. He let cats roam freely among his furs and pelts and coats in his fur shop in Wisconsin. Violet decided that all the cousins should each make a kitty block, and she would put them together for a birthday celebration. Nick loved his quilt, and it hung in his shop for several years. However, Adrienne has no idea of its whereabouts. In 1960, Adrienne took some of the remaining blocks that weren't used from the original quilt and made the cousins and by the cousins and remade the quilt for herself. And she added a picture of the quilt with her Uncle Nick in our story. It's cute to see. The next one, Adrian's, this is called Spanish Dolls, was a gift from Adrian's mother-in-law. Adrian is unsure who made this hand-pieced and hand-quilted quilt or when it was made. The dolls are embroidered and appliqué. The fabrics are cotton and quite possibly contain original 1930s fabric. Adrian presently keeps this quilt in a closet, but now that she's brought it out, she might display it in her home. They gorgeous? Woo. And Adrian's last quilt that she has shared with us today, this quilt was given to Adrian's mother-in-law, who then passed it on to Adrian. There is no record as to who hand-pieced and hand-quilted it, but it is thought to have been made sometime in the 1920s. Quilts made during this time period usually were backed with muslin because it was a cheaper fabric. However, the back of this quilt is made from a fancy floral fabric. Adrian stores this quilt in a closet and will pass it on to her children if they want it. And we have a special lady, Ruth Sharp, she helped us out a lot, helped me out a lot here, laying out these quilts on our bed. So thank you, Ruth. Many quilt tops are sewn together, quilted and bound, making it to the finished stage. However, many tops never cross that finish line. Oh, how well we know that. Ruth Sharp owns the next 3 quilt tops and keeps them in an 89-year-old cedar chest at her home. They were made by her grandmother, Alice, is it Rosalie? Rosalie Hertel
Yes.
Gramey?
And her last name was Greeny.
Greeny, okay, of Springfield, Illinois. They all are hand-pieced and hand-quilted. During the quilting process, the quilt was stretched on a quilt rack in the middle of the living room. It filled the room, allowing only enough space for the sewer to get around it to sew. The basket quilt is wider than it is long, requiring the baskets to sit on their side, or maybe it was meant to have an extra long drape on the sides of the bed. Oh, that's the next one coming up. Sorry. That's the area we need to mark. So here's the basket quilt. And you'll notice when they hold it up, the baskets are sitting on their side. Because these quilt tops are very fragile, Elaine Ekdom pinned them onto a sheet to give them support to prevent tearing as they are lifted and folded. No fabric was considered too small. If a large piece was needed, Alice just sewed another piece onto it to make it the right size. One has to look closely to see where she did that. Let's go ahead and look at the next one. No one knows the exact age of these quilts. Is that right, Ruth?
I don't.
But they were made by the grandmother of a now 85-year-old. Here's a picture. Oh, you gave us a picture to look at with a story of Alice's, where a picture of Alice was taken in 1965. So they're just priceless, just priceless. And Ruth, thank you for sharing them with us. It's lovely. We'll take very good care of them. We have just a few more. Oh, we just have one
I
more,
don't know
I
what
guess.
to do with it.
This is the postage stamp quilt. Margie, help me with this last name, ladies. Janatti? Is that right? Is the owner of this postage stamp quilt top, which was made in 1924 by her mom, Maggie Piercy, at the age of 16. Think of that. Maggie used her time while, this story is amazing. She used her time while sitting on the horse guarding cows to sew this quilt. Now think of that. They could not afford a fence, so people in the family took turns making sure the cows didn't stray, and she used her time wisely sewing this quilt. But I do wonder how many cows actually did get away. Right. Each piece was individually cut and sewed together by hand. Most of the postage stamp squares finish about 3/4 of an inch. Finished. 3/4 of an inch. Maggie would never tell why this quilt was never finished. Maggie added the borders sometime in the 50s and 60s. Margie was given the quilt when her mom moved in with them. Maggie knew that Margie would be the best one to take care of and appreciate not only this quilt, but also the 50 other quilts that she had made. Of all the quilts Maggie made for family and friends, she never made another postage stamp. Wait, until 1996. Oh my goodness, at the age of 88.
Oh my goodness.
Wow. She made a queen size quilt for Margie's bed. Wow. She never used a machine for quilting and made all of her quilts by hand. Margie says this about her mom. When she put a quilt on her homemade quilting frame on Monday morning, no matter if it was a baby quilt or a king size, it was always done and out of the frame before Sunday morning. There were many times she was quilting when we went to bed and still quilting when we woke up. Except for farm chores, you didn't work on Sunday. The quilt needed to be done. As far as Margie knows, this quilt has been in a cedar chest forever and says that is where it will stay. Wow. That's absolutely amazing. Great quilt to end our bed turning with. These quilt makers express themselves through these quilts, which are valuable, and not only in monetary worth, but also historically and sentimentally. I hope you've enjoyed learning about their legacy. Thank you all for coming so much. And the next show will probably start in 5 minutes. How long did this take? Thank you so much.
Loved it.
Next show's at 11:15.
My daughter-in-law.